What struck me when I was thinking about this particular part of the discussions of Ireland's experience throughout, and it's something we've touched on a lot throughout various different discussions, and this whole area of the warrior and the warrior class. And I'm putting forward an argument, and I'll try to piece my understanding of what happened during the Civil War, but it's impossible to really understand our Civil War, which is as recent as 100 years ago, without understanding what went before it. But the interesting thing, there aren't any people who most likely would have received their history here in Ireland, their history education. But what I'm particularly wanting to point out was this thing, as I say, we've touched upon before, the legacy of the patriot's journey, in a way, the patriotic hero, right through from our mythical stories of Cuchulainn and all the wonderful, amazing feats that he had was able to accomplish, and particularly as a warrior, right through, again, these are kind of no particular reason, but I always remember as somebody in national school, the tragedy of the slaying of Brian Boru in Clontarf, when they had just defeated the Danes, and actually that battle was the final ending of the Viking threat to Ireland. So we lost a great hero in Brian Boru, and he was much lauded and became someone that we always looked to as well as a great hero. I particularly was taken by Robert Emmet in his probably ill thought through, badly organized revolution, Edward Fitzgerald, a namesake, and particularly the impact Wolfe Tone had on the belief systems, the kind of sacred scripture of republicanism that was embedded at times, kept underneath, and then every now and then would actually come up and strike a blow for Mother Ireland. And that was the way I learned my history, in a way. And these were people who, particularly from Emmet, Fitzgerald, Tone, they were all the believers in striking a blow. The 1848, the Thomas Davis, all of those, they believed in the right of use of I suppose the gun or the sword in order to vindicate Ireland's rights. The constitutional wing went in a different direction, very often parallel, but in a different direction. But then you have this amazing declaration of the Irish Proclamation of Independence outside the GPO on Easter Monday. And it particularly evoked the right to strike for independence, and that right coming from God and the dead generations from which she receives her old tradition of nationhood. Ireland, through us, summons her children to her flag and strikes for her freedom. Now, that proclamation was something in 1966. We were discussing this recently. We, as children in national school, learned off the proclamation. This was high pageantry. There were amazing celebrations of 50 years of since the revolution of Porrick Pierce. So those leaders knew themselves very, very well that they were not going to survive. They were actually making making a major gesture with their own lives, that they were sacrificing and lighting a fuse for further insurrection for a next generation. And they would join this wonderful panoply of Emmett, Fitzgerald, Tone, etc. So they were right. They succeeded. The English, British authorities really fell into their trap in a way, because they ham-fisted empire, the largest empire the sun never set on. They dealt with and suppressed the rising so ham-fistedly that they created wonderful martyrdom. So the post-rising Ireland, the British authorities, they turned a very hostile population to the insurrection. And we all know that there are a lot of people who felt very angry. And it's an extraordinary thing to look at the photographs of the buildings around the center of the city, how incredibly the destruction was amazing. Now, the destruction was primarily from British armaments. They were not. They used incredibly ham-fisted way of actually dealing with this very small insurrection group. But they also turned around, they carried out the executions, spread over quite a long period of time, with each individual execution gaining more and more publicity, etc., particularly in the United States. And then they turn around and they incarcerate 3,500 Irish volunteers who played no role in the rising. So all of this, I'm really, the reason I'm mentioning all of this is that this kind of goes towards the development of this bond that a lot of the participants in the War of Independence and later into the Civil War, that bond was very, very strong. And it's an historical bond. As we know, and then in 1919, because of the way the British had handled matters, Sinn Féin won an amazing general election and became abstentionist and started the first Dáil. So while Sinn Féin set about state building with courts and tax collection and all various different things in parallel to the British system, which was being ignored, and civil disobedience was very much the order of the day for a lot of people as well. You also had this conflict of the IRA hitting RIC barracks and getting its weaponry, because they had no weapons. They were very, very few at least. And so they managed to arm themselves with the RIC weaponry. And then the extraordinary War of Independence, which became quite bloody, as we know, they went into guerrilla warfare. And I think they wrote the handbook for guerrilla warfare, as far as I understand. And that's quite an extraordinary thing as well. But it was a very vicious War of Independence. Particularly up to 2021, there were about 300 people were died in the War of Independence up to 1921. But with Bloody Sunday, where, as you know, Michael Collins' crew managed to shoot 14 members of the intelligence officers, British Army intelligence officers, and then in reprisal, a crazy attack on another cultural altar of Croke Park, where again 14 people were shot, innocent people, both players and people who were just at the match. And after that, you had reprisal with I think another number of people, British forces killed in Kilmichael, and then 1,000 people actually died throughout the War of Independence, with 4,500 Republicans interned. And we were discussing Ulster there with Fiona and Norman, and interestingly enough, during this time in the War of Independence, there were 500 nationalists killed in sectarian clashes, because partition had been created as well. So sorry, that seems like a very, very long, and I don't mean it. I think it's just important to emphasize the whole business of blood sacrifice and how important it was, as the proclamation describes, coming from dead generations and the right of nationhood, etc., and such a long legacy of martyrs that were there to inspire others. So we then end up with this very interesting treaty negotiations, and that's fascinating in itself, but I'm going to ignore it. But some of the reasons why brother started against brother and disagreed, father against son, friend against friend, that split, that tragic split, that it was there, and I'm trying to understand it. I mean, there were so many possibilities that it might not happen, that we mightn't fall into a civil war, but they did, because for various reasons, and it wasn't about Northern Ireland, as Fiona was saying earlier. Partition wasn't the main reason. It was hardly mentioned in the debates in the Dáil over the treaty, but definitely some very, very, I think, very sensible approach, that this was a pragmatic piece of agreement at this time that could become a stepping stone, in the words of Michael Collins, a stepping stone towards greater independence. But for some, for whatever reasons, the idea of an oath which would say, "I do solemnly swear true faith and allegiance to the Constitution of the Irish Free State as by law established, and that I will be faithful to His Majesty King George, his heirs and successors, by law, in virtue of the common citizenship of Ireland and Great Britain." Now, you have constitutional lawyers that have discussed this, and you get this tremendous amount of obscure argument by Eamon de Valera about document number 2 and about an association, about union status, etc. Suffice it to say, people disagreed. And as you know, in that disagreement, you had an attempt by those who actually won the democratic battle, and in a subsequent election that there had been some pact in, the new constitution was actually publicized. But the people decided they wanted peace. They were tired of all the war, 2.5 years, all that bloodletting. So the state builders went about their business, and those who believed hugely in the sanctity of the Irish Republic, and the legacy of the 1916 leaders, etc., that it was worth making a stand against that. So for their reasons, and that was primarily about 75% of the IRA went against the treaty. I think we were discussing as well, about 80 or 90% of Cumann na mBan were very much against the treaty. And unfortunately, they the stand that was taken meant some guys decided to take over the forecourts, and that went on for a while. It was a phony period of time until Lloyd George and Winston Churchill, particularly after an assassination of a general in London by two IRA guys, they insisted that either the Irish Free State would take care of the people in the forecourts, or the British Army would take care of it. So they had very little choice in a way. So the Civil War began with perhaps would say with the bombing of the forecourts. We then have a situation where there was what is known as the War of Dublin, and the very significant win within a week, I think. The forces of the anti-treaty forces fought to keep some of their barracks in Dublin, but they were outmaneuvered, and they were really they had to go primarily into the Munster area, where they held, I suppose, nearly 50-60% of the country in a way. And the war went on tragically over that period. There were some horrific events where you had horrible things carried out against each other because it descended into a guerrilla warfare. The state forces were hugely successful by virtue of being better armed. Were able to outmaneuver a lot of I suppose their former brothers in a way, where guerrilla warfare became the order of the day. Once the normal civil war that was on a more conventional basis, once the irregulars or the IRA, once they had lost that part of the war, it became a guerrilla war. And as I say, I don't think there is much point in my mentioning some of the horrific cruelties that were carried out on both sides. Now, I'm sure you too as well would have witnessed some of the interviews of people whose either parents would have been involved or had suffered during the Civil War, and the pain that is etched on people's hands. You know, even people who actually participated and did things they say they really regretted, or things they felt they had no choice but to do. But they were just really horrible. You often hear people say that there's one thing about actually fighting the old enemy, but to actually fight your former colleague, your former brother, your former combatant, you know, all of that tremendous bonding that had taken place, to be pulled apart, it had an amazing impact psychologically on the people involved. It also, from the point of view of the incremental period of time of having been involved in the War of Independence and now into the Civil War, there had been an incremental buildup or a greater tolerance for violence. It became nearly a way of life. Kill or be killed, reprisal, some of the acts that they could never have imagined they were capable of before. And I don't think it's any point in it, but in my describing any of them, although I've gone through them over the last number of days, but I do believe that the Civil War still, because of that silence, that we've talked about before, that tremendous silence of our inability to talk it through because it was a nightmare, because people did horrible things, because people believed that end justified the means, or that they had to do things because of the sacred sanctity of a republic. Things that I'm not going to make any political points, but things that seem to have been able to be done afterwards, that had been that had been thought about. But I think one of the things that strikes me is that very often, I think any of us are capable of terrible acts, that heart of darkness that people experienced during the Civil War, and been hardened. I know I would have felt a level of disgust at bombings during our period in Northern Ireland, but these were people who also carried out these things at a time, and for what supposedly was a just cause. But there is this business of a mythology of blood sacrifice, of warrior lore, and the mythology of the sanctity of an ideal that can make people do really horrible things. So I leave it there.